I want to welcome you to our event here with Ambassador Prudence Bushnell. She was former ambassador to Kenya and the author of her new memoir, Terrorism, Betrayal, Resilience, My Story of the 1998 U.S. Embassy Bombings. I should note this is a joint event with our sister program, the Transnational Threats, and Seth Jones is going to join us later in the program to provide his perspective on some of these issues. Seth and I wanted to invite Prudence to talk today because I think her story and the story of the embassy bombing is really important, and it continues to be really relevant, especially in the light of the attacks last month at the Riverside complex in Nairobi. You know, the 1998 embassy bombings has become somewhat of a footnote in our collective memory. You know, it was the attack followed by the U.S. attack, the attack on the U.S. Cole that preceded 9/11. And so it's part of this narrative of the rise of al-Qaeda, but it quickly pivots, right? The narrative quickly pivots to Washington and New York City, to Tora Bora, to Abbottabad. And what happened in Nairobi fades into the background. And I think what Prue does in her memoirs is she reminds us that al-Qaeda had global ambitions and a global footprint from the very beginning. This was the first strike on U.S. interests, first successful strike on U.S. interests and U.S. citizens, and it happened in Africa. That's another thing that's often minimized or forgotten. But at the core of Prue's story is a personal one. It's about talking truth to power, it's about persevering through tragedy, and it's about becoming resilient. Refreshingly, Prue does not pull any punches. I think you're going to see today that she is going to do some straight talking, some real talk. She talks about the constant requests for additional security and how they were upgraded or declined for bureaucratic reasons. She shares how the immediate U.S. response from Washington missed the mark, and she details the lackluster after-action report. Now, I don't think, Prue, you can correct me, I don't think your intention was to settle scores. You know, as we've talked over the last couple of months, you know, my sense of you is that you're a problem solver, and that you're looking to dive deeper into two big questions. What happened and why, and what should be done, what should have been done, and what can now be done. And I think that's our objective today. Through Prue's story, we want to retell this important chapter of history and connect it to the threats that are ongoing today and reflect what we should do today. So the game plan is that Prue is going to come up here and do some opening remarks, and then Seth and I will join her for a conversation on the chair, and then we'll open it up for a couple of questions. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Prudence Bushnell.
Good morning. Thank you for coming out on a somewhat gray day to talk about a rather sober topic. This is a story about policy and people, and what happens when you put one in front of the other. And I note that if there is one building in the United States other than the White House and Congress in which the walls echo voices of policy, it is CSIS. So I am very happy to be here. I was actually implementing U.S. policy one day, a Friday in the month of August 7th. Part of the U.S. policy toward Kenya was to promote peace, prosperity, and democracy, and what part of that would we not like to do? I was in the office talking to the Minister of Trade about an upcoming trade delegation to be led by then Secretary of Commerce Daley, when we heard a noise. I was sitting on the couch, configuration actually just like this room, and because we were in one of the most congested downtown areas of Nairobi, the first thing I thought about was construction noise, like the implosion of a building. And I asked, is there some construction going on? The minister said, no, I don't think so. And he and almost everybody else in the office got up and did what human beings do everywhere, which is walk toward the noise, walk toward the windows. For whatever reason, I was the last one up. I took maybe 3, 4 steps forward, when a freight train blast of percussion threw me back, knocked me out for a bit, came to, thought I was going to die. I did not, and then went down 21 endless flights of stairs because we were on the top of a high-rise building separated from the U.S. Embassy by a very small public parking lot. And as we walked down those endless flights of stairs, I kept thinking, all I have to do is get back to my embassy, get to the med unit, and I will be okay. What I did not know, and only realized when I got out of the building, was that a pickup truck with 2 perpetrators had come into that small parking lot and come up as close to the building as possible. One of them got out and hurled a stun grenade, which was the noise we first heard. He then ran away. He is now, as we speak, at U.S. taxpayers in Florence, Colorado, in a maximum security prison. His colleague, the other perpetrator, 10 seconds later, pushed the button and 1,000 pounds of TNT exploded in a very small area. It was when I got out and saw the hellish sight of flaming cars, the back of my embassy, which had melted into rubble, and a 7-story office building next door, which had completely pancaked and was filled with frantic people desperately trying to get those buried under the rubble out of the rubble, that I realized no one was going to take care of me. In the embassy, we suffered 50% casualties. I still maintain, had we been a military unit, we would have been taken out, because you do not keep people there with 50% casualties. But we were not. We're the people without the guns who stay. We suffered 34 Kenyan deaths, 12 American deaths. Those who could make it out of the embassy regrouped on the steps. It included a 19-year-old intern, regrouped and went back into what was a death trap of a building to rescue their colleagues, to find the dead, and ultimately to pick up dismembered pieces of friends and neighbors. It was my job to move on, help this community as the leader of a community, and it was a particularly bitter job for me because for 2 years I had been pushing back against the policy of the Department of State, which was to stay within budget. And in order to stay within a starvation budget, it was the policy to waive the security requirements that the Department of State had itself levied after our building in our embassy in Beirut had been blown up. You may or may not recall that Jim Baker, when he was Secretary of State, had the brilliant policy of opening up 18 plus diplomatic facilities in the former Soviet Union, telling the Congress and the people, this is not going to cost you a dime. Well, guess what? It didn't cost the taxpayer a dime, but it sure did cost the employees, civilian employees in missions overseas, because the resources left, particularly left the continent of Africa. And again, the policy was to stay within budget. So as the ambassador of a community in a well-known vulnerable building, was sending back cables saying, this is not a good policy. You need to pay attention to our location. I was ultimately told to stop nagging. It was the policy in this city to do things right. And doing things right means staying within the budget, get invited to the right meeting, and continue with whatever the group think is. Those of us who are the ones who implement policy, and for many of us overseas, implement policy without guns in our hands. The issue comes down to people. I made the decision 24 hours or so after the bombing that I was going to take care of my people, and I'll tell you why, because 24 hours after the bombing, I was being torn from one place to another. Everybody needed to see me, and I couldn't be in one place. I could only be in one place, and we had severely wounded people who were about to be medically evacuated, and I chose to go to the hospital. Why? Because the advice of a mentor, a man by the name of Don Lydell, when I became ambassador, was take care of your people and the rest will take care of itself. It became our policy within the senior team of Nairobi, Kenya, to put people first. We made that a policy objective. We put it on the front page of our embassy newsletter so that everybody knew we were putting people first, and guess what? This community of Kenyans and Americans, people with black skin and white skin who spoke different languages, who worshiped in different places of worship, who had the same tears coming down their faces, we did it with people who came from all around the world, Foreign Service and others, to help us rebuild. We actually resurrected our organization. We assisted Kenyans at large. 213 people had died in Kenya, 750 businesses were blown up, 5,000 people had been wounded because they walked toward the windows. We did the best we could to help them recover, and we helped one another heal. That's what you can do when you take care of your people and you put people in front of policy. Okay, what happened after the bombing? Well, we were bombed on August 7th. By Labor Day, we were old news. Look at the newspapers, we are out. What were the newspapers talking about? They were talking about the sex scandal that surrounded the White House, which was a huge distraction. What was the U.S. government's reaction to the bombing? It's what we do all the time. We send in the missiles. So after sending in a missile into Sudan and some other missiles into Afghanistan, accomplishing nothing, we did nothing. There was never congressional review, never an after-action report from the Department of State or any place else, and nothing was learned from the bombing. Nothing was learned about how a man in a cave in Afghanistan could blow up 2 diplomatic facilities and get away with it with impunity when he was under the scrutiny, yes, my friends, the FBI. Alex Station was doing nothing but looking at him. That FBI was CIA, Alex Station, CIA. FBI I-49 squad was doing nothing but looking at him. The NSA was tapping him, and Richard Clarke at the National Security Council was conducting a covert war against him, and notwithstanding the scrutiny, this guy gets to blow us up, and then blows us up again on our battleship, the Cole, and we don't pay attention until 9/11, and then what do? We declare war. All right, here we are, 17 years later. How's it going? How is it going today? Well, after 17 years of trying to kill a tactic with a war and change ideologies with bullets, we are, as I understand from reading the newspaper, negotiating, yes, with the Taliban. Excuse me, weren't they the guys we came into Afghanistan to boot out? Okay, we're at a stalemate in Afghanistan. We've declared the end of terrorism, or the end of ISIS in Iraq, maybe, although there's disagreement about that. And we have spent trillions of dollars, disrupted the lives of millions of people, including the service members we have sent back to that area time after time after time. Don't you think it's time for a change? And here's the thing. I happen to be so proud of being an American, in part because I think it's part of our national culture to organize, and we are problem solvers. And guess what? We're going to solve this problem, and I'm delighted to say that I am over 70, so it's not my problem anymore. It's the problem of many of you in the audience, and I'm here to help. Yes, I'm from Washington, and I am here to help. And I want to invite both Judd and Seth to please come up here so that we can talk about, if this is the problem, how do we solve it? Before I do, let me just give a shout out, number one, to my husband in the back, Richard Buckley, who helped research and write the book. And also to Johnny Carson, who took my place after Nairobi. So he picked up the pieces and carried on. All right, come on up, guys. We're going to solve this problem. And then we'll go upstairs to the military secretaries and tell them what we decided, right?
All right, Prue, you gave us a really hard assignment. We have to solve this now. I want to make sure that we also recognize Mark Bellamy, another former ambassador to Kenya. So we've got almost the whole, knife collection, right? We've got the whole set, the whole box set. I was hoping, Seth, you could take us from the 1998 bombing and kind of connect the line from Prue's story to where we are today.
Sure, and I'll try to do it briefly and then highlight a number of the issues that Prue brought up, because I think she brings up some important questions that we need to collectively think through. One of the things that has struck me since the 1998 and then the Cole bombing, once 9/11 happens, is the word choice we use immediately after 9/11, which is we declare a war on terrorism. So the focus of really the next 17 years or so has been, not entirely, but has been the use of military and intelligence force against terrorist organizations in multiple locations. First al-Qaeda, then the Islamic State when it begins to emerge, breaks away from al-Qaeda in Iraq and then emerges. But it's a terminology we use, and we deploy large numbers of American forces, over 100,000 to both Iraq and Afghanistan separately, and it's the way we conceptualize it. And if we come up to today, we're still conceptualizing this in military deployment terms. So we're withdrawing military forces from Syria. We're considering withdrawing military forces from Afghanistan, as if the way we deal with these organizations is entirely or even predominantly military in nature. And that leads me to a couple of comments. One is we need to step back, first of all, and understand what terrorism is and how it's defined as primarily political movement. It is not military. It is the use of violence or the threat of violence, but to achieve political aims. So it is political in nature, its objectives are political, and the use of violence is a means to that. So what it means then is not necessarily that military force isn't or can't be a component of it, but the political, and that includes economic, ideological, and other components, are primary. I mean, this is what this phenomena is about. Second is just where we are today. I mean, the Center for Strategic and International Studies put out a report at the end of last year, at the end of 2018, highlighting that we have near unprecedented numbers of Salafi jihadi groups, Sunni extremists, from Nigeria into Somalia, North Africa in places like Libya, through the Middle East in Iraq and Syria, into South Asia in places like Afghanistan, and then even some areas of Southeast Asia. So what is striking to me after we're now over 2 decades after the bombings that you so eloquently and poignantly talked about. We have 4 times the number of, according to our count, of Sunni extremists than we had on 9/11. Now, many of them aren't plotting attacks against the United States. Most of them aren't. They're primarily interested in violence in their own areas. But hard to argue that we are effectively grappling with this issue in a range of areas with the military instrument, which is, I think, how we can continue to conceptualize it. So what I think that means is 2 final comments. One is, I think we've got to get a better perspective on the issue, first, of terrorism. The number of attacks the U.S. has suffered, either its embassies or at home, has been small recently. That's not to say the threat is zero, as we tend to either understate the threat, as I think we have, and say we've defeated it, or that it doesn't exist. And I think we've been at that end of the spectrum before '98, and now we've defeated it, which is clearly not the case. So we've been on other, the various ends of the spectrum. To put this issue into perspective, it is a concern. The U.S. is not going to collapse because of the terrorism issue. We need to take it seriously. The U.S. has plenty of other issues it needs to worry about around the globe, from global warming to the economy to Chinese and Russian issues, some cooperative, some competitive, but to put it into perspective. And then lastly, coming back to my initial point, is the political nature of what we're dealing with. This is where we should have started, is understanding how better to bring diplomatic development and other instruments of U.S. and allied power to deal with these issues in the countries where we're seeing these issues of concern. And I think that's what strikes me, and we can deal with this more systematically. That's what strikes me, is the agencies and departments in the United States government that are more effective on the political nature are the ones that now have the least funding for these kinds of activities. So not only do we talk in terms of the military component, but we're funded to deal with this primarily militarily. And I think we're way out of whack on how we both think, how we fund, and how we implement against this issue. I think that's how I'll end it here.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great transition. I wanted to raise General Waldhauser, the commander of AFRICOM's testimony yesterday, because he actually made a very similar point. So since the beginning of this administration, the number of strikes in Somalia have rapidly increased. AFRICOM says they have killed 323 al-Shabaab members in 50 strikes, and then another 118 just at the beginning of this year. And General Waldhauser said, strikes alone are not going to defeat al-Shabaab, but the paradox is that we're actually not putting any resources on all of those other elements. So we've ratcheted up the kinetic, the military approach, particularly in Somalia, next door to Kenya, which is having obviously reverberations, but we're not doing any of the other important elements. Both we're not resourcing it, we're not prioritizing it. There's a rear guard action, thanks to Congress, to keep the budget levels at what they should be, or at least at a minimum. But Prue, how have you thought about this issue? We're overly weighted on military, and we're underweighted on all of the things that really matter to address some of the political issues, the economic issues that are driving people towards extremism.
We need a change. As you point out, we desperately need to look at the push-me factors and the pull-me factors. Richard and I last week were in Gulfport, Mississippi, along the Gulf, 60 miles east of New Orleans. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I wanted American people, interested American people like you, to understand what it's like to serve the United States and create change through peaceful means. I am a person of peace, and I believe in dialogue. The questions that came out of people who were supposedly not interested in this. We all the diplomats say, oh, we have no constituency. Well, excuse me, talk about a self-defeating mantra. Richard and I were in a room full of 60 people from South Mississippi who asked questions like, are acts of violence in our country acts of terrorism? Or do you need to be yelling Allahu Akbar in order to be perceived as a terrorist? What I took away from these conversations is that, not surprisingly, American people are at local and community levels like this, thinking far beyond the political leadership in Washington by asking questions like this. And I honestly do believe, as a boomer who is handing things over to Gen Xers and Gen Y and Gen Z, boy, are we giving you delicious problems, because you couldn't fight terrorism more poorly than we have. So go for it. Let's start, first of all, it would be really interesting to hear from our military colleagues what happened, what has worked and what has not worked in the past 17 years. So before we draw the curtain on this part of our history, let's at least learn something from it. And then start talking about how do we get the people without the guns to change the ideology of people who want to blow us up because they can't think of a better political way of doing it. We've done this before, we can do it again. It's a question, I think at this point, of Americans getting up and saying, hello, member of Congress, hello, new member of Congress, hello, administration, elections in 2 years, and you know that this town is all about policy. Every elected official has a limited amount of time to get policy done in this town, and President Trump is doing exactly what President Obama, all Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. You come into Washington on a political agenda, you have less than 4 years to implement, you bring in as many people as possible who understand the agenda, and you go for it. Okay, let's talk political agendas for the next 2 years and get some movement into finding peaceful ways of solving problems that our military, bless their hearts, are never going to be able to solve. Thank you.
So one of the things, Prue, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that has happened, I think, in the last 2 years is that we have really downgraded the importance of freedom of expression, political pluralism, and human rights in our conversations with our foreign partners. And it's detrimental, right? It's detrimental because it closes the space for actors to engage with their government, and so they look towards a violence means. But there's a study from UNDP which suggests that 71% of the former members of extremist groups, African extremist groups that they polled, joined Boko Haram, joined al-Shabaab, joined al-Qaeda in the land of the Islamic Maghreb because a family member or a friend was detained by the government. And so if we are going to continue, I was gratified that we're reducing some of our support for the Cameroonian military that was just announced yesterday, but if we continue to not talk about human rights with our foreign partners, and if we do not push for an open society in these countries, then I think that this cycle is going to go onward and onward. There's one other thing that I wanted to mention, because since the bombings, there has been increases and improvements on hardening our embassies and facilities across Africa. But that's had a downside too. They're Fortress Americas now. I served in an embassy in Abuja. It looks like you are in a different universe from the rest of the country.
Or we don't have embassies.
Or we don't have embassies. And so, yes, we're safer, our diplomats are safer, but I think that we are more standoffish to publics. And I think that security has become so paramount that our diplomats, and Johnny and Mark, you can join in and counter this, but I think that they're hesitant to get out into the field and to talk to everyday Kenyans or Nigerians or Burkinabe, not because there isn't the desire to do so, but because the security obsession is so high. So I think we're almost we're cutting ourselves off in the knees a little bit because our outreach is so constrained by these security preoccupations. I don't know if, Seth, those things resonate with you as you look at the more global picture.
Well, no, I think they do. I wanted to go in a related direction, and you talked about the military component as well. You know, when we look at a number of other terrorism cases, so setting aside the al-Qaeda and Islamic State kinds of terrorism that we've dealt with, it's interesting to look at terrorism groups that have ended or largely ended, where the levels of violence have come way down, and what some of the factors that have contributed to it. So one can look over the last 2 decades at the Colombian case. One can look at the Northern Ireland case. You can look at others. We had, in the early 90s, we had Mozambique, we had Namibia, sort of the end of the Cold War cases. A number of these actually ended up with, I mean, there were still military and law enforcement efforts going on, but they ended up increasing political dialogue with groups and individuals. One of the things that struck me in looking recently at the Colombian experience is how by 2016 we have largely taken the FARC off the battlefield and put them into the political arena where they are participating. Now, it hasn't ended violence. They are still, there are still groups, the ELN in Colombia, that are still active. There are still acts of terrorism committed. But we're in a very different space from several years ago. I think the British experience dealing with the IRA, after first focusing on military efforts to deal with them and deploying military forces, then constabulary and intelligence, and then political settlement, which we got in 1998, takes the vast majority of the Irish Republican Army off of the battlefield. The real IRA stays and continues to conduct limited attacks, and there still are a small boil number. But we got to the space where we're dealing with the kinds of issues you noted earlier. They may be individuals that had joined because family members have been detained. They may have been joined for other reasons. They're looking for a job or others. But it's recognizing the political element. So as I look at other cases where the U.S. has even been involved successfully, in El Salvador in the 1990s, there was a Chapultepec political settlement. It's not possible in all cases, and you can try and fail. The Afghanistan question will be an interesting one, which the U.S. is now probably better now than ever seriously looking at a political settlement, which will be extremely challenging. But I think this is where trying some of these approaches, specifically in countries, I mean, I've been struck by Somalia, where we have largely focused on a military solution there, rather than a political one in a weak state. So, you know, I think those avenues looking forward are likely to be more promising.
Yeah, in Somalia recently too, I mean, we had a really key defection from al-Shabaab, a guy named Mukhtar Robo, who was the deputy commander. He wanted to get into politics, and then, you know, the Ethiopians and the Somali government eventually blocked him from doing it. So you had this potential opening to bring some of al-Shabaab into the political system, and then you know, we undermined that. Prue, dialogue with some of these groups, what do you think?
Absolutely. I was very lucky in that one of our senior political officer in Nairobi was Muslim, and we reached out to very marginalized Muslim groups in Kenya before the bombing, and it was critically important after the bombing when we had hundreds of FBI come into Nairobi and move into the Muslim community. It became an issue of security. And I want to take this opportunity to say, being a female diplomat has huge amounts of advantages. One of the advantages is that you can say things that men can't say to men, as in sitting down the FBI, senior FBI person and the members of the Islamic leadership in Kenya and saying, I want you all to exchange phone numbers right now. You, FBI, would you please communicate? And you, Muslims, would you please remember the fact that we too are victims? And I walked, we're all victims. So this isn't we and they. We walked out, and one of the leaders came up to me and said, oh, madam, I wouldn't want to be your husband when you get angry. So this kind of communication doesn't mean you have to agree with everything they say, but I learned from a very smart Mauritanian special representative of the Secretary General, who was in Burundi during huge ethnic clashes, who said the following: I keep them talking. I call them up all kinds of hours of night and day and bring them in to talk, because if they're talking, they're not killing each other. So it really comes down to something quite simple, which is dialogue. And it's, I think, harder to hate somebody with whom you've established a relationship, even if it's not a pleasant one. It's more difficult to kill. And I do think that we as a collective society are moving more and more into issues of dialogue, because climate change isn't going to occur through nation states. We are heading, I hope, toward a point where human security becomes at least as important as national security. And when we get toward addressing issues of freedom from want and freedom from fear, we're going to be a lot closer to addressing the reasons for terrorist attacks.
You mind if I ask a question? I'm actually curious, as part of this discussion, with the opportunity of hindsight now, after 98 and then the Cole bombings and 9/11, your perspective on how we, and this is with an eye toward the future, it's not just looking backwards, but how might we have better responded before and after the bombings? Either taken it more seriously, some concerns that you had, or reacted better after them?
Well, first of all, we needed to look deeply into the eyes of our Saudi allies to say, we need to have a chat. I learned, to my utter astonishment, only 2 weeks ago, that a Saudi charity that was going to attack us. The charity was called Al-Haramain. This was in 1997. We had intelligence that they were going to attack us. I sent the cable back to Washington and was told, don't do anything about it. Let's see where the breadcrumbs lead. Finally, when I learned that the arms from Somalia had arrived and an attack was imminent, I requested and got from the Kenyan government, the authority, they went in and disbanded this organization. Well, 20 years and some months later, I read in the newspaper that this was a charity funded by the Saudi royal family. So the first thing I would have done is to go, no, okay, folks, sit down, let's have a conversation, and why are you funding an organization that is threatening to attack the US Embassy in 1997? And you don't have to go in with bullets, you have to go in with determination in your eye, and if you really want to upset the dictators of this world, I have the solution. Bring a woman with you. They hate it. No, they really do. Alpha male dictators don't particularly like a lot of people, but they really don't like having to interact with women as equals. And I have found that something as easy as that can provoke a whole lot of change.
One of my favorite stylistic decisions you make in this book, Prue, is you have these subheadings where it's Jakarta, Nairobi, Falls Church, right? New York, London, I'm making this up. New York, London, Beijing. And I I think that you're trying to convey, you can correct me, but you're trying to convey how connected
We are,
the world
yeah.
is. And partnerships and the kind of engagement that you're talking about is done too infrequently. We focus on, when it comes to dealing with terrorism or name the issue of national concern, we talk to Europe, maybe we talk to the African counterpart. We rarely bring in, whether it is to demarche and tell them, hey, cut it out, or to say, hey, Indonesia, Malaysia, maybe you have a voice here that would be more effective than the United States. We published a piece earlier, or in the middle of last year, talking about just the incredible increase in global engagement in sub-Saharan Africa. Between 2010 and 2015, 150 new embassies were being built in sub-Saharan Africa from other countries. And the Gulf state was at the top of the list. Qatar, in Turkey, I mean, they went 16, 17 different embassies. So there's a greater universe of countries that are interested in Africa, whether it's for the economic opportunities or it's because they're worried about the security threats. And if we're not talking to them, if we are standing on the sidelines, which is generally what's happening right now, I think we miss real opportunities to make sure that this problem is addressed, constrained. There's creativity in how we deal with problems.
Right.
I don't, Seth, do you see, I mean, I know we have the big counter-ISIS coalition of how many members, but is that happening in earnest, that cooperation where we're asking expertise from other regions to help us with problems in Africa or Afghanistan, et cetera?
I mean, I think it varies considerably. Obviously, in the Somalia case, the primary partners have been the AMISOM countries, plus to some degree the French and the British, and there's an EU training mission there. The challenge, though, I find, having been involved in the Somalia mission quite a bit, is even in a country like that, how stovepiped most of the missions get. So it's, there may be some discussion about how poorly, when it comes to strategic planning down to tactical level implementation, there is real serious coordination that goes on between these countries. If you take others, there are countries like Libya where we do see pretty significant numbers of extremists. We had the attack in 2017 in Manchester, UK at the Ariana Grande concert. Salman Abedi, who blew himself up as people exited the concert, had strong networks in Libya. Yet Libya is an interesting country where there's some training, but nobody really wants to take the lead in trying to deal effectively with a political solution to Libya, because we've got multiple governments. So what I found is variations in how effectively we're working, or we've got gaps and nobody really wants to take the lead responsibility for a given area. So everybody chips away at bits and pieces, but some of the key issues never get effectively addressed. And I think that's what I see in key parts of North Africa, certainly in the Horn, and then in the Sahel as well, probably West Africa along with that.
Well, we've done a lot of talking over here. Why don't we open it up to questions, and we can keep working on Prudence's call for change. Sir?
Yes, first I retired from the federal government. But,
We have a
We'll get
mic
a
coming to you
microphone.
in a second.
They need it for the audio.
Yeah.
oh, okay.
So our friends on the internet can listen to
Whatever. The Pat Spann, I retired from the federal government, and I was actually in Nairobi in '81 and '84 doing physical security survey of, at that time was considered a new building, which I thought was amusing, that later on when the bombing, they said this old building, I mean, by African standards, a building that was built in '81 was very new. But, and I was part of, I was working for one of the political sections. But I actually commented on that driveway that we shared with the high-rise bank building was a security risk, and this was in the spring of '81, and it shows how responsive people are. Well, my real question is, I tend to believe in the political things, and of course you didn't bring out the fact that certain administration during the '90s cut the agency's staffing by 25% and closed a lot of the places I had visited in '81 were no longer in existence by the late '90s. The components of the embassies. But it seems like the trouble with the political function is that you're dealing with basically an ideology, but also the ethnic the tribal and ethnic groups in these countries, especially in Africa, are very, they view life as a very zero-sum game. And I don't know how you get over that, hundreds of years. I mean, I've spent some time in Burundi, and the Tutsis and the Hutu don't like each other, and they have a 150-year history reinforcing that. And so what is the solution? Unless the powers that be somehow become enlightened, how do you get around this attitude of it's a zero-sum game? My tribe's on top, and yours has to be on the bottom. There's no such thing as a sharing. I mean, that's to me, that's the big problem in that part of the world.
I don't see this as an Africa phenomena, and I always look at Belgium. The Flemish and the French have not gotten their act together for hundreds of years. So it is a human condition with which we have to strive to overcome. There's some problem. I mean, we Americans think that we can solve the problem and then go and have a hot fudge sundae for commercial, and we can't. But we sure can keep trying to do so. And we have actually become less violent as a global community than we were in the last century and the centuries before. So we're moving forward, not fast enough, and that's an issue that issues of race in our country are ones that we are still struggling with. So universal human condition is not perfect, which is why we need diplomats and people of peace.
Well, I think there's also some really interesting research that in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that the zero-sum politics is becoming sort of a minor theme. It's not to say that it's gone away, but as there's more economic diversification and stratification, we're seeing voting based not on regional lines, but on issues in countries like Kenya or Nigeria that now has a devolved system, so that there is not just one particular position where all resources come from the presidency, but you can compete for governorships. I think that's also had a mitigating effect. So I would just say that it's not the worst starting point, but there's been a lot of evolution in the way African politics operate that I think undercuts the idea that it's all zero-sum all the time, and particularly it's defined by ethnicity, and which I think is also a false narrative that sometimes it's defined by region or religion or whatever identity makes more sense, just the way that in America identity sometimes drives who we vote for and who we perceive to be ahead of us or behind of us.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is, I don't think there's any, or there shouldn't be an expectation, certainly not in our near future, where you're going to stop violence from occurring, right? So there will be competition at multiple levels within states and across them that will continue. I think on this subject, the question is, we have, and it's been this case for the last 2+ decades, where we're in a period of pretty significant transnational extremism, where, I think by the mid-90s, we started to see this ramp up. We started to see the movement of these individuals. We started to see plotting against embassies and against foreign capitals, including in the West. So I think part of it is also how do we find ways to start to mitigate some of that activity. And I think there are ways of doing that. We are by no means going to prevent, stop, end violence in African countries. Whether we can get a better handle on some of the transnational extremism, I think is a much more realistic expectation. I think it's actually occurred in a few places that I think we have some positive lessons.
Let me go to another question. Sir.
Thank you so much.
Sir, please use the mic.
My name is Dasko Sherwani, and I work for Kurdistan Regional Government. And I agree with you with the change. I think the problem is State Department. They still live in the 1950s and 60s, and they don't know what people. And most of the people, I was as a Kurd, We don't fight because we enjoy fighting, because we want freedom, justice. That's what. But especially men, I agree with you. Men and diplomat don't understand what's happening, but women feel it, and they will want to do the job precision. So isn't it time to change the State Department people to learn and make more friends for the United States instead of making an enemy for the United States? Thank you.
Thank you. I know that I have many colleagues, former, current, and future, who are working to do just that. The State Department, like the view from Washington is very different from the view from the field, and I get back to how I began this. That is, behind policy, you have people. And if you forget the people as you're making the policy, which is very easy to do when you're trying to go through your policy agenda as quickly as possible before you come up for another election, you forget the people. And you also forget to think in long terms. We are such a short-term country. Terrorism will take a long time. Peace in the world will take a very long time. But that doesn't diminish the effort. May I say something about this book?
Please.
I want to have you look at the cover. This is actually, this is what policy failure looks like. The photograph was taken about 4 or 5 days after the bombing. We had, as I mentioned earlier, a 7-story office building that pancaked. Hundreds of people were buried under the rubble. One of those human beings was a woman by the name of Rose Wanjiku. She survived for 4 days under rubble and became known as the Kenyan Rose. She was the hope that we had all had, and she died 15 minutes before rescuers could get to her. The Israeli Defense Forces that had come from Israel with sniffer dogs and the ability to go through the rubble had, after Rose's death, decided that there were no people alive under the rubble and had an ad hoc wreath-laying ceremony. And a photojournalist, John McConaughey from Texas, took this photograph. Actually, Richard, also known as Top Spouse, was right here, but he was cut off. This photo won the 1999 Pulitzer Prize for photography. And when I wrote the book, I wanted this to be on the cover to represent the experience. I went through LinkedIn and found John McConaughey someplace else in the world. I sent him an email, and I swear to you, within 20 minutes, he came back and said, "Thank you for your service. This photograph is yours to do whatever you want with, and would you please send my mother an autographed copy of your book?" So I am here to tell you that there are citizens who appreciate what we are doing, and there are mothers everywhere who will make their sons appreciate what we are doing.
Thank you, Chair. You know, one of the things that all of us are thinking about right now is the attack on the Riverside complex last month, where several people died, including an American. If I could ask you, Prue, if you were running embassy, U.S. mission in Nairobi right now, what are the things that you would want the embassy to be thinking about? What are the messages you would be sending to Washington right now to think about the vulnerability of particularly these soft targets, right? They're not hitting embassies anymore, but they're looking for the Westgate malls and they're looking for the Riverside complex. What are the things, perhaps lessons learned from your book about how do we think about threats to our African partners and to U.S. citizens in these hotels and other soft targets?
Well, I don't know if you saw an article that was in the Daily Beast that was put out by Project Government Oversight, POGO. And it points out that on Monday of last week, the Kenyan security guards who protect our embassy, and by the way, it was a Kenyan security guard who refused to allow the perps to come as closer to the embassy than they did. The guards have gone on strike. They have they have been in a labor dispute with the U.S. and with the guard contract that comes from Canada. And the day after Ambassador Bob Godek left on a Sunday, the next day, the guards had a sit-in, refused to show up for work. These are people with guns who are in dispute with the Department of State over a labor incident that the Kenyan courts have already ruled upon in their favor. So when I think about lessons learned, for crying out loud, get the money and pay the people to keep us safe. This is not as difficult as fighting terrorism. Once you get safe, and yes, I agree that the pendulum has turned and we live in terrible, terrible fortresses. We need to do something about that, but we also need to stay safe, and that means paying the people with the guns who protect you. See why they need women in charge, really? Yeah. I mean, truly, this is, hello, it's been going on for years.
If I could ask a follow-up question to that, one of the other interesting aspects of Nairobi has been, up until recently, that's been also the location of the U.S. Embassy for Mogadishu, for Somalia.
Right.
So this has been a concern. You know, what's your view, the trade-offs between even having or not having an embassy and what that allows us to do? There's a security issue that one has to think about whether to have an embassy in a country like Libya or Somalia. There's also a downside, which means almost de facto, at least a major part of your solution in Somalia becomes military, because that's who you have in country, and so how do we think through that trade-off, which will continue to be a concern in Africa?
Well, you start by asking the people who are on the ground, why are you here? What are you doing? Can you do this safely and effectively, and hopefully thrive in the process? So I would start from the ground up, and if we can't do our job safely and securely, then maybe we shouldn't be there for the time being. And taking embassies away, I think, is a huge cost to our country and to Americans, and I would not advocate that. But rather than going to a contractor in Canada and talk about the safety of Americans in Kenya, I would go to the Americans in Kenya and say, what did you all need? I have to tell you that after the bombing, because taking care of people and the rest will take care of itself, that meant that I had to learn how to ask powerful questions and listen to the answers. And I ended up taking most of my orders post-bombing, not from Washington, but from my team. They knew exactly what needed to happen. So rather than having Washington as the end-all and be-all of foreign policy, let's put our money and support into the people in the field who are implementing those policies and see what they have to say. And then stay flexible, and for crying out loud, get sufficient money so that we don't always have to go through a boom and bust period of embassy security or not.
That's a great point. Why don't we open it up for another set of questions? Okay, I got one here, and then we'll go to you, sir.
Hi, my name's
Wait for the mic,
Brown.
ma'am. Thank you.
Is this working? Yeah.
Yes.
I had arrived, my husband and I, Steve Weiscarver, arrived August 30th. And Steve had gone to the embassy to see you, to do his, official meeting with you, and he was late. And he had just been to a security briefing, and they told him, medium threat of terrorism here. And so he didn't see you, so he couldn't go to the country team meeting. And so he went down into the basement at Cafe and had just bought a cup of coffee, was paying when the explosion happened. And he actually recounts that. He wrote a book and it recounts that. But it was just, for me, I was listening at home. I had 2 kids, had no idea. I was hearing they were talking about finding bodies before they stopped that. And, I didn't know if Steve was in the building or what. I eventually, Buff McKenzie called me and told me that he was okay. But anyway, the next, month or at least the immediate aftermath of that, I just wanted to thank you for making it as smooth as possible for spouses and other employees for ISK. Very appreciative of being included and having people come from Washington and having discussions and trying to get through the whole trauma. So I just wanted to thank you.
Thank you for being a part of the community because we did it together.
Yeah.
We did.
And thanks.
Thank you. You had a question, ma'am?
Hi, my name's Emma, and I'm a student at George Washington University. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. And my question is that given the importance of the partnerships that we have with the people on the ground, what will the effect be of the U.S. withdrawal from Syria, given the importance of our partnerships on the ground there?
Seth, you get to do that one.
Yes, Seth. Go on.
There are 2 parts of the question. The first one is the how. And I think for those who didn't watch the testimony of our U.S. Central Command General Votel on Tuesday before the House, there's the how this was done. Whether the U.S. keeps forces in countries is and will always be a subject of controversy. There's blood costs that come with that. There are military costs with that. But when there's a decision to pull out forces, just as there is to push forces in, there should be a deliberative process in the decision making that then gets translated to and explained to allies in the region, in the country. And I think the reality in the Syria case was never explained well within the U.S. government. It was certainly not explained to allies in the region. And so what happens is that the U.S. has to react to a statement made by a U.S. policymaker and explain after the fact why it's pulling out and how it's pulling out and when it's pulling out. So I think there's a how it's done or not done that's a challenge. I think the way Syria withdrawal has gone on the how front has not been the best way and has caused unnecessary confusion about what the intentions are, if it's going to happen, when is it going to happen. So that's the first issue. The second one is I think there is a growing impression right now, either rightly or wrongly, that when you combine the National Defense Strategy, which says that the U.S. now is shifting away from terrorism and towards state competition. So now we're focusing on China and Russia and Iran and North Korea. Not terrorism as much anymore. Still an issue a little, but when people see a withdrawal, and then we're discussing this this is Syria in a broader context. Now we're discussing the withdrawal from forces in Afghanistan. And we're also discussing the withdrawal of forces, military forces from the Sahel and from Somalia as well. So there's a broader question mark about whether we're now overcompensating. Now we're pulling out of these regions. And what struck me a little bit about the Syria withdrawal discussion and then the broader context is it hasn't been an issue of, instead of focusing on the military instrument predominantly, here's how we're going to respond to this serious issue with these primary instruments of American power with allies, and there's a burden sharing argument. There are French operating in Francophone Africa. There are the Turks and the Jordanians and other allies in the region in the Middle East. It's happening largely in a vacuum, still predominantly in military terms. So I think those are my two primary concerns with how Syria has gone in the withdrawal, and how and in what ways the U.S. explained it. I think it's a problem. There are serious terrorism issues in Syria. There's the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an al-Qaeda linked group operating in western parts of the country. There's still an ISIS threat both in Syria and Iraq. This is not going away. So I think a better explanation of what the U.S. is going to do, if it's not the military instrument, is a much better, would have been a much better way of framing it.
We have a question right there.
Thank you so much for the lovely book you've written. My name is Judd Devermont. We have a problem here that I don't think that a military solution can really solve. In 2006, we had a conference in Abuja on national security, and we brought in all kinds of experts to discuss this. We know for a fact that these terrorist groups, their grievances are not monolithic. They're quite varied. But have we? I mean, it seems that eventually everything degenerates into the fact that we are fighting. And why are you fighting? Well, because we don't like each other. Why don't you like each other? I mean, it becomes a vicious circle that we don't know exactly why we're having this problem. And so we use military action to subdue and suppress these insurgents. Will it be better to actually begin to look at these problems from local and domestic issues? Why are they attacking foreign interests? Why are they attacking their national government? What gave rise to all these issues? And how do we address them? Because, just because you're feuding, then that leads to that's why you're fighting. Well, that is not the problem. And this will continue unless you address the fundamental problems. Mm-hmm. So to attack embassies, to attack Western interests, but more importantly, destroy civilian infrastructure and civilians themselves in domestic settings, that continues to be a problem. And meanwhile, we haven't addressed why they are having these problems. So I don't know if any of you can address this issue. I mean, these different groups have different issues that they are bringing forth. And unless we address them systematically, this will simply degenerate into a vicious circle of we are just fighting because we are feuding. Where are you feuding? Well, we are fighting. And it just continues. I hope someone can shed light on this.
Well, I think slowly, humanity is getting there. I was raised in post-World War II Europe. Now, talk about people who had been fighting. The Europeans had fought each other for centuries until they finally almost destroyed their countries from World War I and World War II. The fact that Brexit is happening without a war, I think, is a hurrah for Europe, really, for all of the fussing. So it is happening. In Colombia, as Seth points out, in Northern Ireland, in Mozambique, heaven knows Rwanda is struggling. There are efforts to do it. It's very hard for human beings to change, especially when you have a gun and it's so easy to buy a gun and kill somebody else. This is a struggle that I think we are facing in our country and around the world, and good people have to continue to move forward. And it, I think, is going to start at the local level and move up, not at the top level and come down, which is why discussions like this, I think, are really important.
I couldn't agree more with your question and with Prue's answer. I just want to add, having been in the U.S. government, I think we certainly know that there's local drivers to these problem sets, but then there's this problem. When a group affiliates with al-Qaeda and ISIS, the narrative, it's amazing, the narrative changes, and all of a sudden, like, all of the agency and all of the interests and all of the objectives of that local group are just bleed away, and it becomes it's portrayed as a puppet or an extension of these affiliate groups. And so I think we need to stick with focusing on local issues. We need to be much more clear-eyed when we talk about why a group affiliates with one of these, with al-Qaeda or ISIS, and understand there's probably going to be conflicts between the local affiliate and the larger network, and think about how do you exploit, take advantage of that. There's always disagreements between the different groups, and oftentimes what I found is that Shabab or Boko, they join because they're having leadership squabbles, or they want the strategic guidance, or they want a better media presence. I mean, there's all these sorts of things that we unpack, that you can unpack to understand that. But that's second to understanding your point in proves that it's a local dynamic that is at the root of it that we have to address. Why don't we do a couple more questions, Mark? Then we'll go over here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mark Bellamy. I was ambassador in Nairobi from 2003 to 2006, and I very much look forward to reading your book, Prue, and maybe this question is answered in your book. It's a little bit of a philosophical question, but I wanted to ask what, after all of these years of reflection and all of the lecturing and mentoring and teaching and now writing this book that you have gone through, what have you concluded in terms of our collective ability to learn from our mistakes and to apply the lessons of what we've learned? I ask that because shortly after I arrived in Nairobi, I found myself embroiled, actually it was a quarrel that I provoked, with the State Department, and particularly with our Diplomatic Security Bureau and with our Office of Foreign Buildings, about a residential housing compound that was being built in Nairobi in what I felt, and I think the country team and everybody else felt, was in an extremely exposed position, and it was riddled with vulnerabilities, I think, for our community. And I pushed back, and I got ferocious pushback from the 7th floor of the department, largely for the same reasons that you were being pushed back, for budgetary reasons. I must say, I often thought of your example while I was going through this debate. And fortunately, it had a happier ending than what occurred in 1998. But I remember thinking at the time, how is it possible, 5 years, this is 5 years after 1998, that we would be going through this exact same debate? And I'm sure that we're going through this same debate somewhere else in the system today. I ended up being a little bit of a pessimist after this experience, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I spent many years in Africa, and one thing that African people taught me is it's never hopeless. It is never hopeless. The reason I wrote the book and the reason I have meetings like this and will continue to do it is because the problem hasn't been answered yet. And as long as the problem hasn't been answered, I am going to be talking to people and say this is still a problem. I addressed Deputy Secretary Sullivan on the 7th of August. I addressed Mrs. Pompeo on the 6th of August. And I was quoted in the Pogo article on for heaven's sakes, the fact that after this last attack in Kenya, we are not paying the security guards that the Kenyan court system says deserves to be paid. And I say, Mr. Pompeo, where are you? And I'm saying again, Mr. Pompeo, where are you? And you know where he is? He's making policy. So as long as this city and the political amateurs who come through our departments, and yes, I can say that because they're political amateurs. These folks don't know about diplomacy. We know about diplomacy. They come through and they say, oh, well, we're only here for 4 years and training diplomat. I'll let somebody else deal with it. As long as they're going to do that, I'm going to be standing up and saying what I said today and will continue to do. And someday, and part of this comes from Susan B. Anthony, who died before women got the vote. But she never gave up. And if we don't give up, and if we retired foreign service people maybe go up to Congress and say, what in the world is wrong with you? That you can't keep the people without the guns safe, when it would never occur to you to put people with the guns in a situation of being unsafe. So knock off the double standard. How about that?
Great answer. I think we'll have our last question, and Seth will then close the event.
I guess I wasn't expecting so much pressure, but thank you for coming. I really appreciate you sharing your time with us. I'm Michael. China has focused a lot on Africa and in economic development and infrastructure in particular. And America doesn't seem to be following that route at all. We seem to be very invested in military programs and kind of, increasing military and counterterrorism presence, but I don't see a similar level of economic development from us. Do you think that's kind of a failure on our part in helping with the development of the continent? And, are we kind of falling behind? And is there a way we can catch up to the, return of the rate of investment that Africa's putting into the continent?
Well, it doesn't, I think, geez, Louise, why do we get our knickers in a twist because China's on the rise? Oh my God, China's on the rise. What? So what? Do you know the problems China's having? I mean, it's as if, again, let's not get into a zero-sum monolithic. All right, the Chinese are putting African nations into debt for the benefit of China. I will say that one of the things that made me so proud to represent the United States of America when I did was because I could look people in the eye and say, we actually are interested in your peace, your prosperity, and your democracy. China isn't going in there with the same interests. I suspect that they're going to fall into traps. And yes, we should be there, but not because China's there. It's because Africa is a continent that is resource rich, that has a huge amount to, not just to give us, but to teach us. And to ignore 15% of the world's population is to be pretty silly. But there again, look at you young people in the audience. What a delicious challenge we're leaving to you. And while it's complicated, if we have looked at the problem and identified the problem, then solutions can come. And if the problem is that we have only looked at creating change through guns, then the solution is to put our money and effort into creating change in ways that produces peace, prosperity, and democracy for all of us.
Just one note on this too, having come back a couple of months ago from the Sahel, is, there's also the how. And one of the interesting parts about how the Chinese are doing some of the economic development is also with Chinese workers, right, which has created its own set of issues and unhappiness in local areas. So there's definitely some pros and cons.
I think this conversation has been larded with a lot of false facts about what's happening, and I think without a realistic assessment of what our key interests are in Africa, what our businesses can do in Africa. So on debt, China is not the largest debtor, or African countries are not most in debt to China. There's a couple of countries like Djibouti, Zambia, and Congo-Brazzaville that have high debt distress to China. But in general, about 30% of African debt is to multilateral organizations, another 30% is to bilateral commercial, and then only about 20% is to China. So we have to take this on a case-by-case basis. We have to recognize that Africa has huge infrastructural needs that China is trying to fill and that most of our companies are not interested in doing. What is American businesses going to be really good in Africa? They're going to be good at microfinance, they're going to be good in the financial sector, they're going to be good at maybe agro-processing. There's a number of industries that I think we are the world standard and our companies want to do business in Africa, and I think we should take advantage of the new signature program, Prosper Africa, and the new bank that's being developed and really hone in on what we're really good at. And we should focus on what China's doing that is really counter to our interests and counter to Africa's interests. But to do that, we actually have to have a much better assessment of what we're talking about. Even the fact that Seth brought up about Chinese labor, actually, Chinese labor is only, African labor is now 2/3 of all unskilled labor on Chinese projects. Almost all the managerial labor is still Chinese. But there's been some studies in terms of technology transfers, and the Chinese in terms of transfers in terms of skill sets to African workers is about the same as the US or UK companies. So the conversation is overheated, and if we're going to be effective to protecting US interests and advancing African peace and prosperity, we have to know exactly what we think what China is doing that is bad and what China is doing that is good, and what is China doing that we don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about. And that's country specific. That's looking at privately owned enterprises by Chinese, state-owned enterprise by China, and then it's looking at Beijing. And so until we do that, this conversation is just, I find it exhausting because it's all thunder and it's not a lot of analysis. And now with that, I'll let Seth end it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as I was reading through Pru's book, you know, in a number of books you read through and you learn things. You don't always feel necessarily close to or emotionally attached either to the author or the subject. And one reason I would encourage everybody to read the book is you write with such emotion and energy that it feels in many cases that felt to me like I was there with you. And that's something I think that is not only extremely difficult to do, but it's important in getting your message out because you know, it's a way to convey something that is so important, and again is such a valuable contribution to the book. It's more than just what you say, it's feeling it, and I really felt that I was with you as I read it. So
Thank you.
my last comment is just a thank you for that.
Why don't you please join us in thanking Pru today?